Welcome to today's program of Science and You.
Today's episode is a particularly exciting one. We are going to discuss evolution.
Now we know what you're thinking. How can evolution possibly be exciting?
But we're here to prove to you that evolution is not only an exciting and very important part of biology, but it is also not goal-oriented.
But before we get ahead of ourselves, we're going to explain exactly what evolution is.
First discovered and proven by Charles Darwin in the later part of the 19th century, evolution is the genetic change in a species over time, resulting in the development of genetic and phenotypic differences that are the basis of natural selection. Possibly a better explanation is that evolution is a process that occurs over time in which certain organisms with random mutations in their genetic code survive due to beneficial adaptations to their current environment.
But how exactly do these organisms adapt? I mean, they don't just change or become a different species overnight, do they?
No, it takes millions and millions of years for the genetic code inside of an organism to change or form mutations that may end up being helpful or harmful according to the specific environment. If these mutations do end up being helpful to the organism, the mutation will become more prevalent throughout the environment because that organism will mate with more of the population due to its better survival rate. The process of evolution drives the diversity and unity of life.
Wow, evolution seems so complicated. I'm sure our viewers have so many questions.
Evolution is a very involved process. As always, at the end of our program, we will be taking questions all of the viewers have. If at any point during the program you don't understand something or would like a little more information, just text 555-7717. Once again, that's 555-7717.
Thanks in advance for all of your questions. Now, to help us explain this unifying theme of biology, we'd like to introduce all of you to the world-renowned scientist, Dr. Russell.
Welcome to our program, Dr. Russell. We are so happy to have you here.
No, thank you. I just love science, and I'm so excited to help explain the incredible process of evolution to all of the viewers at home.
So, Doctor, we've been discussing evolution, and if I understand everything correctly, evolution helps us distinguish one species from another. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Through the course of evolution, many new species with unique adaptations have formed from a common ancestor. Scientists such as myself use the species concept to help us distinguish one species from another.
Why is it so important to be able to distinguish between species?
Well, if we didn't have rules that tell us what a species is, we might all believe that the world is one big species, which we know isn't true. We use the four species concepts to separate and determine the different species.
Would you mind explaining a little bit about the four different species concepts?
Certainly. One of the species concepts that helps us distinguish different species from one another is the morphological species concept, where a species is defined by one or more different distinct physical characteristics. These traits that distinguish species from one another are called diagnostic traits. An advantage of this concept is that it can be used to diagnose new species in the fossil record. However, a disadvantage is that some species do not have many measurable traits, and sometimes two different species will look so similar that they appear to be the same species. These types of species are called cryptic species. Another species concept is the evolutionary species concept. Because this concept was proposed to explain the process of one species splitting into two species, it relies on the identification of certain physical diagnostic traits to distinguish one species from another. It also requires that the members of the same species share the same distinct evolutionary pathway. This evolutionary pathway means that they had the same small transitional changes in their physical appearance that led to what they look like today. In addition, the phylogenetic species concept is where a family tree is used to define a species based on its common ancestor. An advantage to this concept is that it does not rely on physical traits to define a species. The final species concept is the biological species concept, which does not rely on physical traits at all. This species concept says that the members of one species interbreed and have a shared gene pool. Hence, it means that each species is reproductively isolated from every other species. An advantage of this concept is that it can designate species even when the differences may be difficult to find.
Wow. So you're saying that if I were to look at the fossil record and DNA of previous organisms, I could determine who my common ancestor was? That is so cool.
Wait, I'm still a little confused. How did multiple new species come from an original species over millions of years?
Well, there are two possible ways that we know of so far. For one species to eventually become another, which are allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation. Allopatric speciation occurs when a new species results from populations being separated by a geographical barrier that prevents their members from reproducing with each other. This idea was first proposed by Ernst Mayr of Harvard University in 1942 when he published his book Systematics and the Origin of Species. Essentially what this means is that while one species is separated from each other by a physical barrier, say a mountain or a river, both species will begin to change over millions of years until they can no longer even reproduce with one another. A term associated with allopatric speciation is reinforcement, which is a side effect of the physical barrier between a species. After being separated for millions and millions of years, when these species come back into contact, they discover that they can no longer reproduce with each other. Hence, it reinforces that they are now a separate species. The second form of speciation, sympatric speciation, occurs when one species splits off into two without the presence of a physical barrier that will prevent mating. A good example, though, involves divergence in diet, microhabitat, or both. In this case, a new species will evolve from the original one to become specialized to live in different microhabitats.
Okay, so I understand that we consider organisms that cannot reproduce together separate species. But what is it that keeps organisms from reproducing with each other?
The answer is reproductive isolation. Whether it's physical, behavioral, or genetic, one of these things will keep different species from reproducing with each other. Also, there are prezygotic mechanisms and postzygotic isolation mechanisms. The difference between the two is that reproductive isolation before fertilization is called prezygotic isolation, and reproductive isolation after fertilization is called postzygotic isolation.
Could you explain a little bit more about each of those?
Of course. I'd be happy to discuss both of these mechanisms with you. The first mechanism we will discuss is prezygotic isolation, where there are 5 different isolation methods that keep different species from reproducing. The first is habitat isolation, where species at the same area occupy different habitats. For example, in a rainforest, species from different levels of the canopy do not mate together. The second method is temporal isolation. This occurs when species reproduce at different seasons or different times of the day, so it does not even occur to them to reproduce. The third is behavioral isolation, which is where different species will not recognize another species' courtship behavior, like a certain mating song. Many males recognize females of their species by sensing chemical signals called pheromones. Another prezygotic isolating mechanism is mechanical isolation, where the organisms physically cannot reproduce because the genitalia between the species are unsuitable for one another. The final prezygotic mechanism is gamete isolation, where the genitalia do not suit each other, but the sperm cannot reach or fertilize the egg. Now we will move on to the postzygotic isolating mechanisms, which are the zygote mortality, hybrid sterility, and F2 fitness. In zygote mortality, fertilization occurs, but the zygote does not survive. However, in hybrid offspring of an organism from different species, sterility, the hybrid survives but is sterile and cannot reproduce. A mule, the product of a female horse and a male donkey, is a good example of this mechanism. The final mechanism is F2 fitness, where the hybrid is fertile but has reduced fitness, giving it less of a chance to reproduce.
Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge of evolutionary processes with us, Dr. Russell. I'm sure all of our viewers really appreciate your insight into this seemingly confusing topic.
Well, I hope I've managed to clear up a few things for everyone, because evolution really plays a major role in the study of biology.
Let's all give Dr. Russell a round of applause for her wonderful presentation on our program.
Welcome back from commercial break. Wow, Caitlin, I feel like I really understand evolution now.
Me too. But I think it's time that we address the main point of our program today.
Of course. Viewers, now that we've given you a bit of a background on evolution, we're going to explain the main topic of today's program. And that is the idea that evolution is not goal-oriented.
It seems a little confusing, and at first I didn't believe it. I mean, how could evolution not be goal-oriented if only organisms with certain random beneficial mutations survive and reproduce because they have adapted to their respective environments? I mean, if only certain traits or mutations are beneficial to a certain environment, then isn't evolution goal-oriented?
To help explain this seemingly false statement, we have brought in yet another famous scientist to help explain her work on this very topic.
You may have seen her recently on the cover of Time and Scientific American magazine for her work with the Saloro frog and its evolutionary process. We give you Dr. Eskridge.
Welcome, Dr. Eskridge. We cannot tell you how grateful we are that you took the time from your busy schedule to explain your amazing work with the Saloro frogs. Tell us, how has your research been?
Wow, let me first say that I had no idea when I began my research how much I would learn. Studying the Saloro frog has opened my eyes to the practical application of so many of the different evolutionary processes. It is through my studies of this frog that I have finally come to truly understand the real-world application of the idea that evolution is not goal-oriented.
Well, we are so grateful for your work and cannot wait to hear all about your studies and how that proves that the idea of how evolution is not goal-oriented.
Well, thank you. The best way for me to explain how evolution is not goal-oriented is to go through the ancestry of my new favorite animal, the Saloro frog. I first became interested in this frog while visiting in the beautiful country of Venezuela. Venezuela's rainforests, which are home to many organisms, including the Saloro, have recently become a target for increased deforestation. The Saloro frog is a relatively new species with thick light brown skin and small pupils. It has made many changes from its original ancestor, the Ocellin frog, which was noted for its thin dark green skin and large pupils, as well as several of the other ancestors I have studied in the Saloro's fossil records and phylogenetic tree. The Ocellin frog for millions of years possessed traits that were perfectly adapted to its environment. This organism lived during a time when humans and their technology were still underdeveloped until the rainforests were able to thrive and flourish naturally without human interference. Lush and overgrown, the Ocellin frog, which lived on the bottom layer of the rainforest canopy, was exposed to very little light as the abundance of trees prevented sunlight from penetrating into its ground layer. This caused the Ocellin species to flourish as it had mutations in its DNA that caused the frog to have a dark green coloring, which was essential for camouflage in the environment where the ground layer was green, but the lack of light caused it to appear darker. The trait for large pupils, which enabled the frogs to see better in the dark but be more sensitive to bright lights, was also beneficial as it enabled the frogs to better see their food and their predators in their dark environment. The Ocellin frog's predators were mainly the crocodiles native to Venezuela at this time, who would eat both the frog and their tadpoles, which developed in the water. For this reason, the female Ocellin frog would lay 500 to 600 eggs 500 to 600 eggs per year to ensure the survival of their species. Ocellin frogs also had large webbed feet and thick and long legs to enable them to move quickly through the water in order to escape predators. From these observations, one would assume that the evolution of these frogs would involve longer and thicker legs and feet, as well as darker coloring, enhanced night vision, and a large number of offspring as the rainforest continued to grow and the number of trees that blocked the sun and predators increased. However, changes in the environment can cause the desirable traits in evolution to change. This explains how evolution is not goal-oriented. Because as the environment continues to change, so do the beneficial mutations. Following the fossil record and phylogenetic tree, I observed the second major ancestor of the Saloro frog. This frog is also native to Venezuela and is the evolutionary descendant of the Ocellin. This frog is known as the Solomon frog. This species of frog has dark green skin with brown spots, pupils that are slightly smaller than the Ocellin, thick and long legs and feet, and thicker but still porous skin. The Solomon females still lay roughly between 500 and 600 eggs per year. Do you have any questions?
What did the desirable traits change? I mean, what altered in the environment that would cause the frogs that have green skin with brown spots, smaller pupils, and thicker skin survive due to natural selection, as opposed to the traits that had been desirable in the Ocellins?
Excellent question. What could have changed to alter which traits are considered desirable? Well, the answer is the environment change. A new species with different traits had to form because of humans. That's right, us. Our species managed to have enough influence on an environment to require another species to adapt and form. Deforestation began to occur in the rainforest, and over the time period which the Solomons evolved, the rainforest in Venezuela had lost about 35% of their trees due to deforestation. The loss of trees meant more sun exposure, which explained the need for smaller pupils, as well as thicker skin. Other species began to branch off the Solomons over time as the villages and man-made structures and fences began to create geographical barriers between the frogs. The key concept is that as humans began to alter the environment, the traits needed for survival also changed. When looking at the successful characteristics of the oscillon species, one would have assumed that the frogs would have evolved in that direction, but evolution cannot be goal-oriented since the world around us is always changing.
Wow, that is really amazing. It is incredible that evolution doesn't have a set objective or goal, but rather is altered by the environment and other organisms in the environment.
If you think about it, the species that we know now could change completely in several millions of years. Maybe humans will need extra fingers or tails for survival in the future.
I don't know about the tails or the extra fingers, but I do know that every species is in a state of constant evolution and that the desirable traits will change.
So explain to us how the species of the frog Soloro evolved from the Solomon species.
Well, as many of you know, deforestation has become a major issue and more trees are disappearing. The Soloro frog species is completely brown as the burned down trees and destruction of the ecosystem has led the bottom layer of the canopy to no longer be green. The skin of the Soloro frog adapted to be thicker to provide better protection from the sun as well as to prevent the absorption of the chemicals that are now prevalent in the environment due to the exploitation of the forest. Many of the rivers and lakes in which the frogs and their predators lived have dried up or are polluted, so many of the predators of the frogs have died off. But there hasn't been overpopulation because the Soloro females had to adapt to producing only about 100 to 300 eggs and tadpoles since there is simply less water for them to give birth to their young in. Their legs are longer and leaner so they are better adapted to escape from predators such as humans, and their feet have lost the majority of its webbing as they have been forced to become more land creatures.
Well, thank you for all this information about the practical application of evolution. And now it's time for our viewers' questions. I think you're ready to answer these?
I don't know.
All right, let's see what we had sent in. All right, first question. Doris K. from Arkansas asks, if deforestation continues, what evolutionary changes do you expect will occur in the frogs in Venezuela?
Well, Doris K., that is a great question. Since evolution is not goal-oriented, we can never be 100% sure about how the environment will change or which traits will be beneficial, but if the environment continues in the same pattern, I hypothesize that over time the frogs will adapt to become more land than water animals and have darker brown and thicker skin to protect against predators, sunlight, and chemicals. I also predict that their vision will become less adapted to the dark, meaning smaller pupils.
Well, thank you so much, Doris K.
Thank you, Doris.
And now for our next question from Nathan J. from Kentucky. He would like to know, if deforestation were to stop, would the frogs eventually return to the same physical traits of their ancestor, the ocelot?
Another great question, Nathan J. from Kentucky. Due to the fact that it would take millions of years for forest regrowth, there's no way to predict how factors such as predators, food supply, and human interactions will affect the evolution of these frogs. So, I'm sorry, we really don't know.
Well, that are all of our questions for today, and we would like to thank all of you for answering in and for tuning in for today's program. We will see you next week as we explore the topic of biochemistry. Thank you for watching!